Hi, welcome to Here to Honor. I'm Eva, and today we are talking about how to plan a funeral during COVID-19. Now, this is part 2 of the video series, and in part 1, we looked at some fundamental questions and categories to think through when planning a funeral, including COVID-19 safety considerations. In this video, we are going to talk more about the practical options, the pros and cons, and things to look out for as you're thinking about how to plan a funeral or memorial service during COVID-19. So let me preface by saying that, first of all, it's really important to make sure you are checking CDC guidelines to know what's the latest in terms of COVID-19 safety precautions and protocols. Also, if you're working with a funeral home, you definitely want to check with your funeral home director because they will know what the latest is in terms of what they can and can't do and what safety policies they need to practice. So that's the first thing. Make sure you are checking CDC guidelines as well as any local policies or restrictions that might be in place in your area, and also talk to your funeral home director. We're going to look at 3 options today. 1, an in-person gathering. 2, a virtual service. And 3, a hybrid, which is a combination of the in-person gathering and the virtual experience. Let's start by looking at an in-person funeral service. Having an in-person funeral service carries a higher risk of transmission of the virus. Any sort of in-person gathering means that people in attendance will be at more risk. So that's something to consider if you are thinking about doing an in-person funeral service. You'll have to check to see what the guidelines are in terms of if you can gather, how many people maximum can gather, and that could change at any time, of course, according to the situation with COVID-19. That's something to consider as well, that if you want to do an in-person gathering, it might be smaller in number, and it might also need to be canceled last minute should any restrictions come up that will prohibit you from actually being able to gather in person. There might be some restrictions and policies around food and drink service as well, so make sure you look into that if you are hoping to do some sort of reception along with the funeral service. And it's really important to also make sure the funeral home has the proper safety protocols in place to alleviate risk as much as possible. Holding a gathering outdoors as opposed to indoors can also help mitigate risk of transmission. So that's something to consider. Is there an option to do the service outdoors? There's always the option as well of postponing the service until a later time when it's safer to have as many people gather as you want. So that's something to consider as well. Now let's talk about hosting a virtual service. By now, most if not all of us are used to doing some kind of virtual gathering, hangout with our friends and family, and it's great to be connected in that way, but let's admit it, it does feel awkward. Meeting virtually is definitely not the same as meeting in person, so let's just acknowledge that there is still some awkwardness around that. But on the other hand, meeting virtually is definitely lower risk in terms of transmission of the virus, and most virtual platforms can allow a significant number of people to join. So you can actually have a lot of people be part of that, more so than if you gathered in person. There are also a lot of different technology platform options in terms of doing a virtual service. One of the most popular platforms is Zoom, that a lot of people use for different meetings and gatherings. And it does require some technology know-how and some setup. So that's something to consider, that if you want to do a virtual service, there's going to be a little bit more setup involved in terms of making sure everybody has the app downloaded, everybody knows how to use it, everybody has set up an account, everybody has the computer hardware and software, etc., etc. So that's something to think about, is if you want to do a virtual service, there's a little bit more of the planning that goes into it, probably some tutorial that needs to be involved for your guests to make sure they feel comfortable on the day of the event. And one thing to consider is if you are using a platform, it could be worth it to hire somebody to run all that technology for you. So on the day of the event, you don't need to worry about any potential tech problems, and you can just really focus on the service and being in that moment and connecting with your loved ones. There are actually several vendors that provide the service now of helping to coordinate a virtual service. So if that's something you're interested in, we have a few listed in the text below the video. So feel free to check those out if you're looking for some recommendations for vendors that can help you. A virtual service can still feel very personal and provide connection, but it might take a little bit more forethought and planning into how to make that happen. Of course, there is this awkwardness of everybody being on their screens and kind of staring into the screen together, but there can be ways to incorporate these moments of sharing, to set expectations, to make the experience as comfortable for everyone as possible. So some things to think about are how you might want to incorporate any videos or photo montage that share stories, share memories of your loved one, thinking through how you want to set up times for people to share, how you want to incorporate readings and eulogies, giving clear instructions and guidelines on when to turn on or off their microphones, or when to turn on or off their cameras, and just thinking through the flow, and if you want to incorporate any sort of more casual times for people to just chat and connect with one another during the service. So there are ways to make the virtual service feel more intimate, but it just takes a little more forethought in that. Now let's talk about having a hybrid service. A hybrid service would be a combination of the in-person gathering and doing a virtual service. What that could look like could be having the funeral or memorial service at the funeral home or another venue, but then also setting up a way for the event to be live streamed to other people who are not able to attend in person. The in-person component of a hybrid service would of course follow all the protocols and requirements for in-person gathering. The virtual element of the hybrid service means that you would need to think through the technology needs and the capabilities of that venue to support those technology needs for a virtual service. So here are some questions that are helpful to ask your funeral home or venue if you're doing a hybrid service. One is, does the venue or funeral home already have existing services in terms of running a live stream? Two, does the venue provide staff who are able to assist with setting up and even running the live stream, or is that something that you would need to bring someone in to help with? And three, what does the venue provide in terms of technology accommodations? So for example, the internet connection and any equipment that might be needed. For a hybrid service, you'll have to consider the experience for two different audiences. One is the in-person audience and the other is the virtual audience. So you'll have to think about if the event is more something that the virtual audience just watches and doesn't really participate in, or if you want a way for the virtual audience to also be able to participate. So that's two different kinds of experiences, two audiences to consider as you're crafting your program. So to summarize, we looked at three different options for a funeral or memorial service during COVID-19. We looked at 1, an in-person gathering, 2, a virtual service, or 3, a hybrid, which is a combination of an in-person gathering and a virtual experience. All three options have their pros and cons, but at the end of the day, it's about remembering and honoring your loved one well. It doesn't have to be just one event that does that, and there's no time limit on remembering someone's life. We hope talking through these options today have been helpful for you. If you'd like more resources, you can check out our website at heretohonor.com. You can also hit subscribe here on our YouTube channel for more videos about funeral planning and grief support. Thank you.